Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I want to talk a little bit about these trade rumors that are kind of floating around out there. We're only a month away from the deadline, so let's talk some D'Angelo Russell. What are people saying? What's most likely to happen? I'll give my take on that. Plus, two-man lineups, the improvement of Rudy Gobert and the players that he pairs up with best and why. Also, what has changed recently on that. We'll also look at the standings and the power rankings as we get ready for a lot of games in a short period of time here upcoming for the Wolves. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Happy Tuesday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right, so Timberwolves have won 4 straight. Monday night beating Houston. Sunday night beating Houston on the road, trailing 20 in the second quarter, coming back to win. If you missed that, we had the live postcast Sunday with Marnie from Valley Sports North, and the postgame pod was Monday's show. So we got you all caught up through this 4-game winning streak. Upcoming this week, another very winnable road game against the same Detroit Pistons team that beat the Wolves 10 days prior. That's Wednesday night. So on Wednesday's show, we'll preview that matchup. And then a difficult kind of, I think it's like 4 games in 7 nights stretch upcoming that begins Friday with Phoenix back at Target Center. So as we lead into that, I want to, we're only a month away now, actually within a month now from the February 9th trade deadline. It's earlier than we're used to it being. And there's no real actual solid Timberwolves rumors other than the D'Angelo Russell stuff and the Patrick Beverley stuff, and not necessarily from a trade perspective, but more likely Beverley gets traded somewhere else and potentially bought out, right? He's talked about wanting to come back to Minnesota. Who knows if that's something the Wolves would entertain? It wouldn't surprise me if it was, given some of the things that Pat Bev is best at, the Wolves have been worst at this year. And Beverley hasn't been good for the Lakers. This has been his worst year of his career by far. But and I'm not at all pretending like Patrick Beverley is like the silver bullet to the Timberwolves all of a sudden being a top 4 team in the West. And of course, now they've won 4 straight, but a week ago, I think that sounded good to everybody, right? Before the Wolves went on this winning streak, adding Pat Bev would be fun. There's actually a report recently on Jake Fisher from Bleacher Report, actually, on his Please Don't Aggregate This podcast. I'm aggregating his words. But he talked about Beverley definitely wanting to go back to Minnesota. Jake Fisher, formerly of Bleacher Report, I believe he's at Yahoo now. But anyway, his podcast is called Please Don't Aggregate This. But he talked about Beverley definitely wanting to come back to Minnesota. So that's a thing that could happen. That's not it's not like a sexy rumor because it's not an actual trade rumor involving Wolves players. But the D'Angelo Russell thing is still a thing, right? There was that report a couple of weeks ago about the Heat having interest. Jake Fisher on that same podcast said, let's see, let me get the quote here. He said, I've not been told that he, meaning D'Angelo Russell, has asked out. I don't believe he's unhappy in Minnesota either, but his name is definitely a name in trading chatter as we approach February 9th that's been involved in trade talks since the summer. Now, this isn't surprising. I talked about D'Lo, the potential for him being traded quite a bit over the summer. And he's an expiring contract. And he's last season he played well. So I thought there was a chance they could trade him in the offseason because you could argue he played every bit as good last season with the Timberwolves as he did in his lone all-star season as an injury replacement for the Nets back several years ago. So I thought there was a chance he'd be traded in the summer. The Wolves didn't trade him. And then he started the year slow, had a couple, 3 good weeks, then a really kind of down stretch. And then he's played a little bit better again lately, but still uneven. Like within a game, he'll be uneven. And he's not the only one, but like the Houston game on Sunday is a great example. He was miserable early in the game in terms of turnovers and defense, but he hit a couple of big threes that kept the Wolves offense afloat in the first quarter. And then eventually the defense clicked in a little bit for D'Lo, and it's never great, but sometimes it's okay. And we finally got there in that Houston game. And the whole season's been like that for D'Lo, right? So if the Wolves trade him, it's not going to be another like contender that thinks they're adding a missing piece. It's going to be a team willing to give up some expiring contracts or rotation pieces for a large expiring contract, I guess is more likely. And D'Lo plays the rest of the season somewhere else, somewhere random, and then ends up leaving in free agency. And of course, he's not going to get paid a max contract in free agency this time around. But there will be teams that have interest, and they're if a team thinks they could pick up some assets along the way, or add this expiring contract, cash in some various mid small size contracts they have on their books, then they might do it. It's a bit tricky, right? Because there aren't going to be very many teams that have enough players. Because if there were big enough expiring salaries, the team probably wouldn't be motivated. Whatever this mystery team is, probably wouldn't be motivated to make the trade anyway, right? If it's a bunch of small salaries, it would take too many players to do it. The Wolves wouldn't have the roster spots. You need to include a third or a fourth team. And would those teams have the roster spots, right? And if it was a comparable player, then why would a team be doing this trade in the first place? I guess unless it's, for the expiring contract and the Wolves take back multiple years on somebody who's, who's a good player. That gets tricky too, because obviously Anthony Edwards, potentially Jaden McDaniels are going to be due raises and extensions here soon. And you still have Towns and Gobert, whose dollar amounts, their salary on the books is going to tick upwards for those guys as well. So anyway, it is a real possibility, I think, still, that D'Angelo Russell gets traded. The name that I mentioned the other day that was actually floated on, so we know the Heat have had interest, right? That's been reported. So Bill Simmons of The Ringer had brought up Kyle Lowry as a possibility. And I actually really like that. And I talked about this a couple weeks ago, but like, if it's not Kyle Lowry, well, actually here, let's do this first. Here's why I think Kyle Lowry is a great fit. Like, regardless of, there's a way to do this, right? Because of his salary, and you probably need a third team. And I think in the example, Toronto was the third team in this proposed deal. Again, not a concrete rumor, but a fake trade from Bill Simmons at The Ringer. I think on his podcast, I think on the Bill Simmons podcast, but he had suggested that the Wolves land Lowry. And here's why I think Lowry is a really good fit. I mean, what the ideal point guard for the Wolves is a lower usage guy that can hit open threes, can run an offense, and play defense, right? It's actually why Tyus Jones would have been a perfect fit back in Minnesota, because he can do all of those things, right? He doesn't need the ball in his hands. He doesn't need to be scoring to be effective as a player, but he can score if he needs to, and he can hit open threes. Kyle Lowry, like, he's not shooting the ball as well this year. Let's see, what's his field goal? He's like 33.6%, which actually, if that were to hold, would be his worst percentage in a season since 2010, when he was a backup for the Rockets. So well before he became an all-star. But it would be his worst 3-point percentage in forever. Like, he's been 35% or greater basically every year since then. And last year, 38%, year before that, almost 40%. He's been 39 to 40% like 4 times in the last 8 years. So all that to say, he can hit open threes. I think that number will come up a little bit at some point this season, right? It's a little bit like Karl-Anthony Towns shooting 33% from 3. Like, that's not a thing that's going to sustain itself most likely. So somebody that can open shots, even at age 36. Kyle Lowry is a good perimeter defender. He's about to turn 37 actually in late March, but he's a good defender. He's a good on-ball defender. He's a very good team defender. All those things are still true. And his usage rate hasn't been high in several years. It's at its lowest point now since his rookie season. So he's not looking to score at all. His 3-point rate is also actually the second highest of his entire career to this point, meaning that nearly 2/3 of his shot attempts are 3-pointers. He's not looking to score in any other way. He's perfectly content to hit the spot up 3 on a kick out from Rudy Gobert, or when Karl-Anthony Towns is double teamed, or when Ant is double teamed, Lowry will go, stand in the corner and knock down a 3. All those things are things that Lowry is really good at, and the Timberwolves need. He is such a better fit for the Wolves roster than a player like D'Angelo Russell. Yes, when the Wolves offense is struggling, D'Lo's first quarter against Houston was great. Like, it's nice that D'Lo can do those things when needed, but he detracts from the Wolves in so many other areas on a regular basis that having somebody that's steadier would be preferred. Again, I'm not hating on D'Lo. I think he's a good player. I think he's actually played much better of late. He's been a really important player for the Wolves at times this year. Kyle Lowry's a better fit for this roster. And remember, assuming the Wolves aren't going to re-sign D'Angelo Russell, certainly not anywhere near at the dollars he's getting now, you're going to get nothing for him. Like, he's going to walk at the end of the year as an expiring contract. So if you can get a better fit, even if in a vacuum, we could have the conversation, who's the better player today, D'Angelo Russell or Kyle Lowry? That's a legitimate conversation to have. You could argue it's D'Lo. But the fit with the team, and given the contract situation and some of the questionable, the weird vibes around the team, and that's not for me to decide. That's for the team to decide, the front office, the coaching staff. There's an argument to be made that Kyle Lowry is a better fit in terms of his skill set, what he brings to the team. So something to keep an eye out for. Obviously, Miami's had a disappointing season. They've had injuries of their own. I have no idea if that's something that they would consider, or if D'Lo would even stay in Miami. Like, this fake trade from Simmons I think it had Russell in Toronto. Who knows what they're going to do. So, like, both teams, right? Miami and Toronto, both teams that have had disappointing seasons to this point. Although Miami's played better of late, they're actually in first in their division, but they're only a game above 500. I'd be surprised if they trade Lowry and rock that boat, but you never know. You never know. If they can pick up an asset, that's something that their front office is going to do for sure. All right. Next, what I want to do is I want to talk Rudy Gobert. I want to talk two-man lineups. I want to talk who's played best with Rudy of late and why. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at PrizePicks. Our title sponsors, actually, at PrizePicks today. On Wednesday night, for the Timberwolves game, the Timberwolves are going to Detroit. I would take the Rudy Gobert over on rebounds. That's a team the Timberwolves should dominate in the paint. They're going to rely on Rudy to do that. He's been rebounding the ball much better of late. He's always been good, but really good of late. I would take the Gobert over on rebounds. If you're wondering how PrizePicks works, I'll explain it. It's extremely easy. You just pick 2 to 6 players if they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, not just scoring, but also like field goals made, 3-pointers made, steals, assists, etc. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry, and you're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That includes the NBA, the NFL, MLB, NHL, college sports, really any sport. You can make entries in under 60 seconds. It really is that easy. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, let's talk Rudy Gobert. So, and two-man lineups, because Gobert's two-man lineups lately have been, or not lately, for the season have not been great, right? Like, for the most part, the Wolves offense with him on the floor has not been good. In fact, I didn't actually talk about this at the time, but a few days ago, actually I think it was like Friday. So that's probably why I didn't talk about it on the show. Seth Partnow at The Athletic wrote a fantastic article. Of course, he used to be in the front office for the Milwaukee Bucks, and before that wrote at Nylon Calculus over at Fansided, and is now a full-time writer and analyst for The Athletic, and it's fantastic. He wrote an article all about Rudy Gobert and his defensive aggression and why the Wolves should be concerned. There were a couple nuggets in here which I think were really fascinating. One was related to the Timberwolves offense as a whole with Gobert on the floor and how bad it's been. I know it's been bad, and I know the net rating's been disappointing, but the Timberwolves offense, this is before the Clippers win and the Rockets win. So kind of, after those 2 wins last week, Denver and whoever they beat midweek. I'm blanking on who they beat midweek. Whoever they beat on Wednesday. Denver was Monday. Somebody decent on Wednesday. I know listening to this, you're screaming at your car or wherever you are right now who they played Wednesday. It's running together at the moment. But anyway, Gobert, with the Wolves on the floor through midweek last week, the Timberwolves offense is worse per 100 possessions than the Charlotte Hornets' 30th ranked offense. With Gobert on the floor, let me say that again. With Gobert on the floor, the Timberwolves offense has been worse than the league's worst offense, which is just insane. Now, Partnow goes on to break down in further detail something I've talked about on the show quite a bit, which is the Wolves have shot the ball weirdly badly from beyond the arc. For a team with enough average to above average to good three-point shooters, they haven't shot the ball well. Partnow goes a step further and talks about the shooting percentages from long range for Timberwolves players with Gobert on the floor. And while Gobert's, spacing, or the lack of spacing with Gobert on the floor is certainly to blame for some of it, it doesn't account for how bad the Timberwolves offense has been at shooting threes with Gobert on the floor. The Wolves are shooting only 31.1% from three this season with Rudy Gobert on the floor. That's under 29% on above the break threes. 28.7% above the break. With him on the floor, they're 10 percentage points better at shooting above the break threes. Actually, shooting threes overall. So they're basically 39% with him off the floor. And they're 31%. So I guess 8% different with him on the floor. Above the break, they're actually over 10% better. They go from 28.7% to 39% above the break 3-point percentage, which is actually pretty good when Gobert's on the bench. He goes on to break it down even further and talk about individual players. Karl-Anthony Towns, before he got hurt, was making only 19.7% of his threes with Gobert on the floor, which is just absurd. And he was shooting over 45% with him off the floor. Now, of course, he shot the ball a lot more with him on the floor because they played a lot together and they're both starters and they're two of the best players on the Wolves. And that's why Towns' overall percentage was under 33%, which is nuts because he's a career 40% three-point shooter. But the fact that he's shooting under 20% on three-pointers with Gobert on the floor is just, it's obviously not a sustainable thing. Like, regardless of the spacing issues aren't so bad that Karl-Anthony Towns is going to shoot half as well, under 20% from three as he has for his career. So there's a lot of noise there, right? I thought that was really interesting. Go read that article if you have a subscription to The Athletic, because he does worry a little bit about Gobert's defensive mobility and also the lack of rim protection that he's provided. He's still been okay at the rim, but defending the rim, but nowhere near where he's been for his career. Now, he's been noticeably better lately, and given some of his comments, it's fair to kind of read the tea leaves here and see, that doesn't really read between the lines here. I'm mixing my metaphors somewhat, but the Eurobasket thing, like the he's worn down a bit. Like, there's it's understandable that there could be some bumps here. There's some reasons, for legitimate reasons, that Gobert's had some bumps. He's played better lately, defensively too. So all that to say, it's a good article, so go read it if you have the opportunity to. But something else I wanted to note related to Gobert, the two-man lineups, right? His two best two-man lineups have been with Jaden McDaniels and Kyle Anderson. First, let's talk about Anderson. Kyle Anderson, I should say these are like the higher volume ones, right? So he's slightly positive with Taurean Prince, but they've only played 192 minutes together, mostly because of Prince's injury and also because he's not a starter. So I'm going to talk about like the ones that he's actually played significant minutes with, like Jordan McLaughlin. We talked about this a long time ago before J-Mac's injury, but Gobert and McLaughlin together are a plus 5.7 net rating. Like, they're really good together. But for like regular rotation guys, so basically the top 8-9 guys in the rotation, taking out Prince because the minutes are lower due to injury, Jaden McDaniels and Kyle Anderson are the only like decent net ratings. Kyle Anderson's a plus 9.5 with Rudy Gobert. Together their net rating. And then Jaden McDaniels is a negative 0.1. So that's going to flip positive probably on Wednesday against the Pistons, because they've been playing extremely well together of late. In fact, Alan Horton, the voice of the Timberwolves on the radio, tweeted out about Rudy's numbers during the Wolves 4-game win streak. He tweeted this actually Monday morning, that Jaden McDaniels has 7 assists to Rudy Gobert over the last 4 games against 13 assists to Gobert in the first 28 games they played together. So he's got more than half as many in the last 4 games as he had in the first 28 games this season. And assists to Rudy overall, not just with McDaniels, are 5.5 per game over the last 4 games, after 4 per game assists to Rudy over the first 31 games of the season. So a concerted effort overall to get Gobert the ball more often. I think this tells us 2 things. It's McDaniels improving as a playmaker and becoming more comfortable, and he has played well overall lately. And then the second thing is Gobert is just better within the Wolves offense, making himself available more frequently in better positions. And the Timberwolves overall are becoming more comfortable passing him the ball. It's one of the reasons why I think Kyle Anderson is just a really good player, but one of the reasons he has the best net rating with Gobert is he's a veteran player. He's played with with lob bigs before, right? He had to get the ball. Not that Steven Adams is like the same lob threat as Rudy Gobert, but he had to get the ball to Adams, in Memphis, and he's played with other bigs that are athletic, and Brandon Clark, guys that run the floor, similar type players, right? The Wolves haven't really had those guys on this team. That's just not. Karl-Anthony Towns isn't a pick and roll lob big. He's not a huge threat diving to the rim. I mean, he's obviously a very good offensive player, but that's not Towns' game. Not really Naz Reid's game. It's not really any other big that the Wolves have had play rotation minutes the last couple of years. It's not their game. So Anthony Edwards, of late, D'Angelo Russell hasn't played with the big like that, and everybody's a little bit different. So Kyle Anderson and Gobert finding some chemistry isn't really a shock. And Anderson's operated a lot more of the Wolves offense of late, especially after Jordan McLaughlin got hurt. We've seen a lot more slow-mo operating offense. And so there's been a lot more Anderson Gobert minutes, Anderson in the starting lineup more often. And those guys actually, developing a chemistry together. So that none of that should really be a surprise, but the numbers are now starting to bear that out. And I think it's going to be really interesting to watch as we see those two-man numbers evolve, both because of Gobert's improvement as a Timberwolf, like in a Timberwolves uniform, and also the improvement in regard to comfort level of Wolves' other players, especially perimeter players, especially guards and wings, playing with Rudy Gobert moving forward. I think that'll be really interesting to watch. Okay, let's close today's show by looking at power rankings at NBA.com, where the Wolves are after their little now mini, I don't know, it's 4 games, a pretty legitimate win streak. And also the standings, where they are in the Western Conference. They might be higher. If you haven't peaked, they're probably a little higher than you'd think in the West. We're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season, which is actually, I guess, over now because the national championship was last night. Plus basketball, college and pro World Cup. They've got it all. Well, the World Cup's over too. They've got everything. All the sports that are actually happening now are available over at betonline.net. So be sure to check that out. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline too. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. You can head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Today's episode is also brought to us by our friends over at TurboTax. Go to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Meet with an expert who will do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from the stress of taxes and file for you so you can do not taxes. Show your eyes things that are not taxes. Unpack a moving box of not taxes. Taste not taxes. Sing not taxes a lullaby. Hope not taxes sleeps through the night. Grab a saddle and ride not taxes into the sunset. With TurboTax, an expert will do your taxes from start to finish, ensuring your taxes are done right, guaranteed, so you can relax. Feels good to be done with your taxes, doesn't it? Come to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax, full service products only. Video meeting while expert does your taxes required. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, let's talk power rankings over at NBA.com. If you're a regular listener to the show, you'll know that these are the only power rankings that I really care about because I think they do a really good job. And John Schumann at NBA.com, I guess specifically, does a really good job with them. However, I was a little surprised with how low he had the Wolves. So he did his rankings. He does them like Sunday night, Monday morning. So it includes Sunday's games. He's got the Wolves at 20-21 after their win at Houston on Sunday. And I was surprised that the Wolves are at 21. There were some rankings that were done prior to Sunday's win that had the Wolves a little higher, 18, 19. But he's got them down at 21, up from, I guess I don't know where they were last week, but I know they came up a little bit in his rankings. So they're a spot ahead of Portland, 2 spots ahead of the Thunder, which who would think the Thunder would be 23rd sitting here, second week of January. Toronto 24 and Wizards 25. Who's right ahead of the Wolves? You got the Phoenix Suns all the way down to 20 with their recent issues. And of course, Chris Paul now is banged up as well. Who knows if he'll be available on Friday. And let's see, Utah at 19, the LA Clippers at 18, who the Wolves just beat. I'm a little surprised the Clippers are up at 18. And that, by the way, that Utah's at 19. Utah's now behind the Timberwolves in the standings and they weren't supposed to be good anyway. So I'm not really, they've lost 7 of 8 games. I'm not really sure why they're ahead of the Wolves. Same with the Clippers. The Hawks are up at 17. They're about, they're a half game worse than the Wolves. The Bulls are at 16. They're a half game worse than the Wolves, and the Wolves beat the Bulls. So a little surprising to me, the Wolves are at 21, but I respect Schumann. I think he does a good job with the rankings. He does list, the net ratings, the defensive rating, offensive rating, all that good stuff on his blog or on his power rankings. He says the Wolves remain wacky. 9 days ago, they capped a 6-game losing streak with a loss at home to the Pistons, and since then, they're 4-0 in the West. They're one of only 2 teams that have beaten the Nuggets in the last 3 weeks. But then he also mentions the context of the Denver win with the rest advantage and also the win over the shorthanded Clippers on Friday, which I'm adding this. No Paul George, no Kawhi Leonard also had a rest advantage. And then he said it's nice that they won down 20 against Houston on Sunday, but the fact they were losing by 20 to the Rockets after less than 20 minutes is also, as he puts it, not nice. He says it's nice they won after trailing double digits, not nice they were losing by 20 to the Rockets. But, I mean, hey, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a Wolves fan, you follow the team, that's the year for the Wolves, kind of in a nutshell, is the past 2 weeks, right? The 6-game losing streak with the horrific loss to the Pistons, a 4-0 winning streak, which is nice, but like, rest advantage in a couple games, star players missing, losing, down 20 to Houston, but you come back and win. Like, there's a lot of good and bad there, right? He talks about how good they've been with Anthony Edwards on the floor, how much better Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert have played over the past week or so. And then he closes by saying, having just benefited from the Nuggets' only stretch of 5 games in 7 nights, the Wolves will now have their only stretch of 5 and 7. It includes 4 home games and a visit to Denver. It begins Friday with the game against the Suns. Phoenix won the first 2 games between those teams. But again, I'm adding this now. I mean, the Suns are banged up. And actually, Schumann does say in his write-up about the Suns, he says maybe the most important game on the Suns' upcoming road trip is the one Friday against Minnesota because they have the same record, right? So if the Wolves can win and then get to face Phoenix later this year, at this point, like, we're halfway through the season, the Wolves and Phoenix could be battling for playoff seeding, and being able to avoid Phoenix getting that tiebreaker would be a good thing. So interesting where the Wolves are ranked. Go check that out at NBA.com. Again, I think he does a really good job with these rankings. So I talked a little bit about the standings. The Wolves are currently tied for 8th in the Western Conference, technically 9th because they are tied with Phoenix and they've lost twice to Phoenix already. Phoenix also has a better point differential. So they're tied for 8th in record, but with the tiebreaker, they're 9th. They are one game ahead of, or no, they've played 2 more games than Portland, I guess. They've won 1 more and lost 1 more than Portland. So that gets a little weird with the disparity in games played, but they're 9th in the West, tied for 8th. Only a half game behind Golden State, with, by the way, a slightly better point differential than Golden State. Golden State's a 0.7 point differential. The Timberwolves are 0.3. The Clippers are 6th at a 500 record with a negative 1.1. So the Wolves are only a half game out of 6th place in the Western Conference. They're only a game and a half out of 5th place, which is the Sacramento Kings, who have played really well, but lost a couple in a row now, and actually are on a little bit of a cold streak overall. So, I mean, like, and only 3 games out of the 4 spot, right? Like, there's a real chance the Wolves beat Detroit on Wednesday, and then you get this stretch. You could beat Phoenix on Friday because of the injury issues and their overall issues lately. But a really interesting opportunity for the Wolves. I mean, the Jazz are now, for as much of a fun story as they were, they're now out of the play-in if the playoffs started today. They're a full game behind Portland and down in 11th place. So a real opportunity here for Minnesota to make a move. There are 5 teams between 6th and 10th that are within a half game of each other in terms of winning percentage. And, again, some teams have played 40 games, some have played 41, some have played 42. So it's a little bit weird. And actually, like, the Blazers have only played 39. All that to say, the Wolves are positioned well here. If they continue to stay a little bit hot and can bridge that gap until Towns gets back, hopefully later this month, then we could be talking about, like, legitimately being in the top 6 in the West, which a week ago would have seemed nuts. So pretty interesting, to say the least. All right, Wednesday show, we'll preview that Pistons game. We'll talk about what went wrong, kind of revisit, not too much, because I don't want to, nobody wants to listen to rehashing the Pistons game from a couple weeks ago for too much, but we'll talk a little bit about it. We'll cover a couple other topics on Wednesday's show and get you ready for Wolves Pistons Wednesday night. Of course, we're daily Monday through Friday. A big thank you to those of you who make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. A big thank you for making us your first listen and now make your second listen, the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available in the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.